Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Rock Point Community Church's Kids Rock Devotional. I'm your host, Youth Pastor Johnnie Haddad. Today we'll be following along once again in the Jesus Storybook Bible. And today you'll pick up with me on page 160, the story titled God's Messenger. The story of Jonah and the big fish. Maybe you've heard it. Page 160. Actually, the page that on the corner where the page number normally is looks like that. On the opposite one says 161. It starts, God had a job for Jonah, but Jonah didn't want it. Go to Nineveh, God said, and tell your worst enemies that I love them. No, said Jonah. Those are bad people doing bad things. Exactly, God said. They have run far away from me. But I can't stop loving them. I will give them a new start. I will forgive them. No, said Jonah, they don't deserve it. I'll run away, Jonah said to himself, far away, so far away that God won't be able to find me. Then I won't have to do what God says. It's a good plan, he said, because as far as he knew, it was a good plan. We know a little better than that, don't we? Nowadays. But of course, it wasn't a good plan at all. It was a silly plan because you can't run away from God. He'll always come and find you. Jonah went ahead with his not very good plan. One ticket to not Nineveh, please, he said, and boarded a boat sailing in the very opposite direction of Nineveh. And there he is, going on the boat. Well, it wasn't long before a fierce wind blew and the boat started to lurch and pitch and roll and everyone started turning green. Jonah sat upright in his bed. You see, the first thing that went wrong in Jonah's not very good plan was that God sent a big storm after him. Who sent the storm? The sailors couldn't sail their ship properly. We're sinking! They screamed and started throwing everything overboard, suitcases, food, whatever they could find. By now, Jonah knew that the storm was his fault. Throw me in instead, he shouted to the sailors, and the storm will stop. The sailors weren't sure. It's the only thing you can do to be saved, Jonah cried. And so, 1, 2, 3, heave ho, toss him over. Splash! No sooner had Jonah hit the water than the waves grew calm, and the wind died down, and the storm stopped. Just then, when Jonah thought it was all over, he was sure he was going to drown. God sent a big fish to rescue him, and the fish swallowed Jonah whole in one big gulp. I hope that never happens when I jump off a boat. But, big fish, we don't know if it was a whale or another large fish, but a fish definitely exists that is big enough to eat a human without chewing. Oh, and look at that. There he is on the inside of the big fish. Jonah must have thought he died. It was so dark in there, like a tomb. But then he smelled the rotting food and felt the slimy seaweed, and he knew he wasn't dead. He was in the belly of the fish. Sitting there in the darkness for 3 whole days, Jonah had plenty of time to think. Pretty soon he realized his plan was, well, a very silly plan indeed. He was sorry for running away. He prayed to God from inside the great fish and asked God to forgive him. After 3 days, the fish spat Jonah out, launching him onto a sandy beach. Just then, Jonah heard someone calling his name. Go to Nineveh, God said. And this time, Jonah listened. Yes, he went straight to Nineveh and told everyone God's wonderful message. Even though you've run far from God, he can't stop loving you. Jonah told them, run to him so he can forgive you. The people of Nineveh listened to Jonah, and they started loving God. They learned to do what God said and to stop running away from him, just like Jonah learned. Many years later, God was going to send another messenger with the same wonderful message. Like Jonah, he would spend 3 days in utter darkness. But this messenger would be God's own Son. He would be called the Word, because he himself would be God's message. God's message translated into our own language. Everything God wanted to say to the whole world in a person. So that's the story about Jonah. Let me ask you this. When you learn what God wants you to do you always do it right away? I know sometimes I would learn what God wanted me to do and I would hesitate. And often when I hesitated, it caused worse problems for me. Not nearly as bad as probably for Jonah. I would run away from God and just get myself in trouble, but I never got eaten for running away from God, thankfully. And this is one of the stories that a lot of people think is just a poem. A lot of people have speculated that there isn't a fish large enough in the body of water that Jonah would have been traveling in. One, it's not the biggest body of water. Two, they don't have fish that big nowadays. Well, truth be told, about a couple hundred years ago, they found skeletons of whales in that body of water. And whales, gray whales specifically, and the gray whale gets to about the size of a school bus. And it's not the biggest whale that exists, but it gets to the size of a school bus. And how many of you know how big a school bus is? Big enough to fit some people in there. And in the olden days, in the 1800s or so, there are stories and reports of fishermen being tossed off a boat during a storm and being swallowed by a big fish or a whale. And the whalers would catch those fish later on and cut the fish open, and out comes the person that was on their boat. And he said he was still alive, was still able to breathe inside the fish, and he said the only reason he had a hard time in the whale was because he passed out because of shock. Not because he couldn't breathe. There was plenty of air, because as you know, whales are mammals and they come up to the surface to breathe. And so this story is entirely possible, given the two facts that people have lived after being eaten by a whale and being stuck in the whale for a number of days, and the fact that the gray whales have existed in the sea that Jonah was tossed into. So a little bit of encouragement. When we look back at the Bible, we find that everything it says is true. And so trust the Bible, trust in God, and lean on His Word for your life. That's that. Have a great week. Bye-bye.